Welcome back. This video is going to continue a discussion of a paper that I wrote a few years ago called Religious Diversity, Truth, and Tolerance. And in this section of the paper, this video is going to talk about some ideas about the application of religious diversity, truth, and tolerance to public education, or just to education in general, or just to maybe interaction in public life of tolerance and religious diversity. So in the first couple parts of the paper, I argued in the first part that religious relativism doesn't follow from a diversity of religious beliefs. It's a kind of a rejection of religious relativism as a specific instance of rejecting relativism generally. So, which I think is always a good idea, to reject relativism. And I gave some reasons why in that video. And then the next video talked a little bit about how rejecting relativism is necessary for maintaining religious tolerance. In other words, unless you have a clear understanding of the objectivity of religious knowledge by first rejecting relativism epistemically and the application of that rejection to religious belief, then you can't have any grounds for religious tolerance in any capacity. So that video walked you through that idea. And then the last video in the series, I argued that requiring religious tolerance at the social level is distinct from requiring religious tolerance at the epistemic level. In other words, I think it's fully compatible for a call a secular democracy or a broadly democratic society like we have in the United States or elsewhere around the world, a constitutional republic that has a kind of separation of church and state. You want to call it that? I know Fosters will argue over what that means, but we don't have a religious state. Right? Our state doesn't require you to have a particular religion in order to participate in public life. But requiring religious tolerance at the social level, in other words, requiring, allowing for the free expression of religion, as guaranteed by the United States Constitution, the practice of religion, and not establishing a state religion. That's distinct from tolerance at the epistemic level. In other words, a particular religious believer might be quite intolerant of contradictory beliefs at the epistemic level, but tolerant of them at the social or political level. And I tried to give you some examples of that in that video. So now the question is, how might these three ideas, and again the three ideas are religious relativism doesn't follow from religious diversity of belief, rejecting religious relativism is necessary for maintaining religious tolerance at the political level, and requiring religious tolerance at the social or political level is distinct from requiring religious tolerance at the epistemic level. So how do those three things play out in public education, or more broadly in public life? Well, first, to whatever extent religion ought to be taught, say, in public schools, for example, as a case, it ought to be taught non-relativistically. So if we're going to have any kind of public teaching of religion, my claim is that it should be taught non-relativistically. Since I've demonstrated that religious relativism is faulty. This doesn't entail that teachers teach that religious beliefs are, as such, are true, or that one religious belief is true and then another is false, even though that may be the case. And I mean, for my own part, I think it's fine if teachers want to do that, probably at the upper grades or at the university level. But what it simply means, rejecting relativism, is that if religion is taught at all, it should be taught to be possibly true. Of course, this raises questions about the reasonableness of ontological naturalism or materialism, which would militate against the beliefs, the truth of most religious beliefs involving non-natural or immaterial realities. So, unless you want to say that in public education, necessarily materialism or naturalism is true, philosophical naturalism or materialism, however you want to put it, then that has to be taught as true. But I think that's probably not demonstrable and probably false as well. So I would say in debates about that that include the teaching of religious beliefs, that should be left as an open question as well. I think that this should be left as an open philosophical question for public primary and secondary education. Neutrality on this philosophical point does not seem unreasonable to me. In other words, just say, yeah, well, could be true, could be false. Here are the arguments. This is where a state presumption of the possibility of religious knowledge might enter into the debate. In other words, my own view is that we should side on the idea that the state should presume that religious knowledge is possibly true. That there's no presumption of atheism or presumption of the falsity of religious belief in public life. So if that's the case, then I think the second point is important. The very idea of religious liberty ought to be heavily taught in our public education system, if religion is going to be talked about at all. But even if it's not, I think the idea of religious liberty needs to be part and parcel of our civil and civic conversations regarding what it means to live in the United States as citizens, both as a historical point in the development of American public life, but also as an important lesson on the very idea of a liberal culture, a free culture. By liberal there, I mean free. This could entail advocating and promoting what Will Herberg called the American way of life, which he defines with the one word of democracy. Defending such a view requires a longer argument. I would simply add that part of the American way of life, at least, has constitutionally enshrined within it the idea that the free public exercise of religion is a good thing. And by public exercise, I don't mean just as something you do in private or your home or your place of worship and get left alone, but the public exercise involves every aspect of human life, and that should be freely developed and encouraged and expected in American civil life. Teaching the historical development and the social consequences, the philosophical justifications and the logical implications of this truth would do much to promote a reasonable rather than a relativistic understanding of the facts of religious diversity in American public life. Okay. And that's the end of the paper. So let me just repeat that last part. Teaching the historical development, the social consequences, the philosophical justifications, and the logical implications of the truth of the free exercise of religion would do much to promote a reasonable rather than a relativistic understanding of the facts of religious diversity in American public life. One of the things I think that's really a challenge for American educators, the public level, but also the private level, but just in civil life in general, is this idea that religion is a private matter rather than a public one. And I think that's just a deeply mistaken view if it's applied to the history of the United States. Whether for good or ill, depending on your views on this, about the public expression of religious beliefs in public life, in and through public life. What is, I think, undeniable is that religion has played the Christian religion primarily has played a massive role in shaping the country that we live in now, for those of us who are Americans. And the United States just simply could not be what it currently is without that. Now, you might think, well, maybe that should change. Okay. But again, I think that's, as an empirical matter, you might just have to ask yourself, when religion declines, when the Christian religion declines within a body politic, what are the consequences? And are those consequences helpful for human flourishing and for a robust civil life, both internally and with respect to relations among other nations? And I think the answer is no. That it's demonstrably false that the decline of religion increases human flourishing. I think you just have to look to extreme cases, and cases where, say, for example, in the history of the 20th century with the great totalitarian movements, which are largely those kinds of movements which seek to squash the Christian faith. in ways that are unspeakable in terms of the suffering that they produced for Christians and other religious believers. And you just have to look at communism for an example of that. If you doubt this, just read up on the genocides of the 20th century and ask yourself how many of those were motivated by people who wanted to increase the amount of the practice of the Christian faith in public life. And I think you'll probably find that exactly none of those were, and that the biggest ones, the largest ones, were those that tried to do the exact opposite. And if you are really feeling optimistic about the human condition and need to tone it down a notch, for example, on a beautiful sunny day, you think, well, human beings are pretty good to each other when it comes to religion and political life. Just pick up a book called Death by Government by R.J. Rummel, and that should disabuse you of any optimism regarding the power of governments to attempt to increase the Christian faith and express it in public life. Because in that book, you'll read about governments that did the exact opposite, and you'll see the disastrous consequences that followed. And now there have been governments around the world over the last 1,500 years, say, that have attempted to integrate religious belief. These are non-Christian systems in ways that have been detrimental to Christians primarily. And if you doubt this, just pick up any book on Christian persecution and martyrdom and ask yourselves, where have most Christians been martyred, under what regimes, under what types of political regimes, prior to the 20th century and during the 20th century and even in the 21st century. Ask which religious political systems that are combined together, which of those produce the most suffering and misery for Christian communities around the world. And I think you'll find that none of those are systems in which the expression of the freedom of religious belief and expression of religious belief in public life that we have enshrined in the U.S. Constitution is largely absent, those movements. So I think it's an empirical fact. Again, I'm not a historian, a sociologist, I'm just a philosopher thinking about some of these things. But when it comes to public life and public education, with regard to religion, including Christianity, my own view is that the Christian faith should be taught, along with other world religions, in public life, and be taught as possibly true, and arguments given for and against any particular religious belief, and left it up to the students to decide that. Again, age appropriately, with young children up through adults in high school. But some parents may think that that's just a bad idea, and okay, maybe so, and maybe within the context of contemporary public education, there might be good reasons to reject the teaching of religion altogether. I guess it raises the question of whether or not, suppose a religious belief system is true, like suppose Christianity is true, which is my own view. Is it better to have it taught badly, or taught as false, or not to be taught at all? And part of me thinks, well, maybe it's better in some circumstances not to have it be taught at all in the public education system, if it's taught as false, right? If it's just belittled and marginalized and taught to students that it is false. But if it's taught as this could be possibly true, and the arguments are given, my own opinion, especially for the older students, is that a wide open field and fair play, intellectually, the truth will always stand. And the role of the Holy Spirit can be thought of that as well, in terms of God's working in and through people that might teach things, if I were teaching something but didn't believe it, and if God is at work in public life, then that may be a way of introducing the Christian faith to an audience that might not hear it otherwise. So I don't know. Probably some more debate needs to be had on that point. But again, the main thrust of this paper and the videos that are in sequence on the channel here deal with rejecting religious relativism, showing that tolerance can only be had amongst religions in public life if relativism is rejected, and that the only way to maintain the kind of constitutional guarantees we have for religious freedom also comes with rejecting relativism. So that's a main point. Even if you disagree with the rest of this content of this video, I think those points will stand, and hopefully you'll find some agreement with those. All right, thanks for watching. Stay psyched, Grom. You.